On February 10th of 2004, a 16-year-old girl, along with her boyfriend, committed an unspeakably heinous act. It involved her father, a baseball bat, and a plastic trash can. And even to this day, many of the exact details of what happened are still unclear. This is the case of Courtney Schulhoff. Hello, friend, and welcome to High Time Crime. My name's Joel, and on here I specialize in true crime and also time travel. Whoa there, Mr. Dinosaur! Calm your horses, okay? Now, back to what we were talking about. It's called Google. But anyways, today we're going over the case of Courtney Schulhoff and what she did to her father. You're going to learn about how a deadly combination of teenage angst and desire for retribution boiled over into cold-blooded murder. For our story, we're heading to the state of Florida, a place we know all too well from our prior videos. But the difference this time is the specific area we're visiting. It's a little place known as Altamonte Springs. Altamonte Springs is a suburban city in Seminole County, Florida. It has a population of around 40,000 people, and overall it's generally pretty safe and family-friendly. With its convenient location in the center of Florida, Altamonte is also naturally pretty close to a lot of different things. If you ever find yourself here, the short list of potential activities includes some interesting stuff. You can visit Crane's Roost Park and stroll through a beautiful walking path filled with fresh landscaping and fountains. You could head over to the Altamonte Mall with a food court, a theater, and more. You could check out Congo River Golf, where playing miniature golf is the name of the game. You could even spook your way into a petrified forest scare trail, which, based on the pictures I've seen, looks like a heck of a lot of fun. But despite how fun and amusing all of these activities sound, none of them are the actual reason as to why we're in Altamonte Springs today. Courtney Christine Schulhoff was born on December 27th of 1987 in Florida to Stephen and Tracy Schulhoff. Not much is known about her childhood, but we do know that as a teenager, Courtney's parents got divorced. And by all accounts, this was something that Courtney found to be extremely challenging. Originally, the three of them, Courtney, her father Stephen, and her mother Tracy, resided in Courtney's childhood home. But after the divorce, Courtney's mother moved out, and Courtney began living exclusively with her father Stephen. Then, at a certain point, Stephen began having extremely bad financial difficulties. And before long, he and his daughter Courtney were forced to relocate to an apartment. According to others, Courtney was initially unhappy at the prospect of moving to the apartment, which was located in Altamonte Springs, but eventually she got used to it. And so, for the first few months Courtney and her father were living there, everything was relatively peaceful. The school she attended was known as Lyman High School, and the time period was early 2003. Her first year attending Lyman, she was evidently an okay student, but now following her parents' divorce, Courtney's academic performance started to take a sharp hit. According to records, she hardly attended class, made very little effort, and went from perhaps an average student to outright failing. In addition, there were other changes to Courtney's personality outside of school. Courtney met a group of friends who had bad reputations and equally as bad of an influence. Not only did her clothing style change, but her behavior shifted to one of overt hostility towards the outside world. And naturally, with her father being the main authority figure, most of this anger was directed towards him. Pretty soon, Courtney and her father Stephen were having explosive arguments between the two of them. And as these arguments became more and more frequent, It was eventually decided that Courtney would be sent to live with her mother Tracy for a bit. Unsurprisingly though, the time Courtney spent with Tracy ended up being short-lived. Not long after living with her, Tracy realized she couldn't put up with this new version of her daughter, and Courtney's father, Stephen, had no other choice but to take her back in. So needless to say, Courtney and her father were once again living together with the same problems as before. Problems that were only going to get worse. After moving back in with Stephen, Courtney's school attendance and participation issues continued, and she was on the verge of failing out. In the meantime, though, she found a new way to occupy her time. Every now and again, Courtney and her friends would hang out at a Greyhound racetrack located across the street from her school. It was here that Courtney met and began dating a 20-year-old college student by the name of Michael. Michael Morin was a former high school football player who, compared to Courtney, had actually done quite well in school, even to the point of getting straight A's. He was now attending a nearby community college, and overall, Michael was reasonably well behaved, and his parents had high expectations for him. But after meeting Courtney Schulhoff, all of that was going to change. The first time the two of them were introduced, Michael had brought his ex-girlfriend at the time with him to a party at the Greyhound racetrack. Courtney and her friends were also at the party, and Michael and Courtney mingled and hit it off. Then, the next several weeks, they interacted a lot more. And before long, Courtney and Michael were practically infatuated with each other and spending every waking hour in each other's company. And partly as a result of her new obsession with Michael, but mostly as a result of her failing grades, Courtney officially ended up dropping out of high school at the age of 15. Naturally, Courtney's father, Stephen, who had constantly argued with her over her failing grades, was absolutely infuriated about this decision. Right away, he was already blaming Michael, thinking to himself, okay, so my daughter suddenly gets this new boyfriend, and within less than a month, she's quit school? This is outrageous. So right off the bat, there was a lot of tension between Stephen and Michael. Meanwhile, because of this tension, Courtney's relationship with her father deteriorated even further. To her, it seemed like her father just didn't want her to be happy. Repeatedly, she tried to convince Michael that Stephen was a good guy, but he just wouldn't budge. Stephen was already set on disliking her daughter's new boyfriend, and nothing Michael did would make him gain his approval. Before long, Courtney and her father were fighting and arguing even more, and Courtney was accusing her father of being abusive. And there is some evidence for this. In fact, one time when Courtney invited a few friends over, including Michael, Stephen came home a bit earlier than anticipated and ended up becoming violent. At the time, Courtney and her friends were in the apartment smoking and drinking when Stephen suddenly burst through the door unannounced. Immediately, he went into a fit of rage and reprimanded Courtney for having a party without his permission. Then after a bit of shouting and yelling, Stephen ultimately ended up slapping his daughter right across the face, all while still in the presence of Michael and Courtney's friends. Before this, these allegations of physical abuse had just been allegations, but now Courtney actually had some real evidence. Regardless, nothing came out of this specific incident. But in truth, both Courtney and her father treated each other terribly. Despite not being in school any longer, Courtney refused to get a job and frequently used her father's credit card without his permission. Oftentimes, Stephen would come home to boxes of new clothes and a bunch of things that Courtney had bought online. And by then, Stephen was getting closer to financial security again, but now with Courtney's behavior, it was becoming far more difficult. Then over the next several months, Courtney continued to act out. And there were many nights when she secretly invited Michael over to the home while her father was sleeping. Before long, Stephen got frustrated at Courtney and her relationship with Michael. and he told Courtney that she was no longer allowed to see her boyfriend. Meanwhile, Courtney blatantly refused to listen to her father, and as opposed to sneaking out in order to meet Michael, she just had him over whenever she wanted to. In addition, every conversation Courtney had with Michael became about all the terrible things that her father Stephen was saying and doing to her. By now, this included claims of something that she had never mentioned before. But as the months went by, things continued to spiral out of control until one day, Stephen Schulhoff took an unprecedented step. After first opening his checkbook and noticing a few pages missing, he called the police and had his daughter Courtney arrested, with apparently the intention being to teach her a lesson. But needless to say, having your family member arrested is a heck of a way to do so. And so following a short stint in jail, Courtney was released with a much greater fear of her father. From this point forward, she now viewed him as not only a stern and abusive authority figure, but as an existential threat. And pretty soon, she was about to take deliberate action to rid herself of this so-called threat. But in the meantime, someone else was added to the picture to make it all a bit more complicated. By mid to late 2003, Stephen Schulhoff was now dating a woman by the name of Elaine. It's not clear how or when the two of them met. But with a girlfriend came standards, and pretty soon Courtney was enrolled in classes with an attempt to acquire a GED, which, for those that don't know, is essentially the equivalent of a high school education. At the same time, Courtney continued dating Michael. And in August of 2003, the two of them had gotten so fed up with Courtney's father's efforts to restrict access to each other that they tried to run away. The only problem was that neither of them owned a vehicle or had any money. So the plan was to take Michael's father's car and drive up to Maryland to beg Courtney's grandparents for financial assistance. But as the saying goes, best laid plans often go awry. Shortly after, Michael stole his father's car, had Courtney hop in the front seat, and started driving up to Maryland. The two of them decided to turn the car around and return back home. Now, what exactly prompted them to change their minds, nobody knows, but the consequences for Michael ended up being pretty bad. Similarly to what happened to Courtney with her father, Michael's parents had him arrested. And after being charged with grand theft auto, he ultimately spent a total of 70 days in jail. Following his release, he was then given probation. On top of this, Michael's parents began demanding that he break up with Courtney, claiming that she was a bad influence on him, which was obviously true. In fact, this relationship was utterly toxic for the both of them. But little did anyone realize exactly how toxic it was about to turn out to be. Least of all, Courtney's father, Stephen, who, within only a few months, was about to wind up dead. So after Michael was released from jail, a couple of things happened that aggravated the situation between Courtney, Michael, and Stephen even further. As we already mentioned, Michael's parents, and particularly his father, attempted to get Michael to break up with Courtney. However, he refused to do so. And in turn, his parents made the decision to kick him out of the house. Now homeless, Michael resorted to meeting with Courtney late at night, sneaking into her father's apartment with Stephen asleep, and then sleeping there. This was of course something that he had already done before, but now he had to do it every night. In addition, Michael had quit college, changed his address to Courtney's father's apartment, and placed the apartment's phone number as his contact on parole forms, all without Stephen's permission. Also, despite having nowhere to live, he never attempted to get a job. So Courtney was now paying for all of his expenses with the use of her father's credit card. And so, before long, Stephen's credit cards were maxed out and he was ready to confront his daughter about it all. But before that could even take place, something absolutely terrible happened to him. On February 10th of 2004, Steven's new girlfriend Elaine was repeatedly trying to call him over the phone and trying to get in contact with him. But after multiple attempts, he never ended up picking up. And so, naturally, Elaine figured something was wrong, perhaps terribly wrong. She decided to head over to Steven's apartment to see what was going on. The time was now anywhere from 2 to 4 p.m., and Elaine was getting into her car to drive up to Steven's home. But as she was driving through the neighborhood and approaching the house, she immediately witnessed a strange sight. According to Elaine, Courtney's boyfriend Michael Morin was outside walking Steven's dog and wearing one of his t-shirts. And the moment the two of them made eye contact, her in her car and him on the sidewalk, she saw Michael rush to make a phone call. So right away, she thought the combination of all of these details were pretty weird. But when Elaine pulled up to the actual apartment building, the whole situation became even stranger. As she was getting out of her car and walking up to the door of Steven's apartment, Elaine saw Courtney outside near the entrance. Then, when Elaine got to the door, she attempted to go in, but it was locked. And so, immediately, Elaine confronted Courtney about it and asked where her father was, to which Courtney responded that she doesn't know. Next, Courtney took off with the key, left Elaine standing outside of the entrance to the apartment, and after Elaine noticed that Steven's truck was still parked where it usually was, she finally decided to call the police. Once the local police arrived at the scene, they were evidently able to acquire a search warrant based solely on Elaine's phone call. So after entering the home through the back door, they immediately began searching the Schulhoff's apartment. And what they found was completely and utterly gut-wrenching. Following a brief search of the apartment, they entered Steven Schulhoff's room, and right away, police noticed blood splatter on the walls and a bloody aluminum baseball bat at the end of the bed. But the worst part of all was Steven's body found in a plastic trash bin with one of his ears torn off and his face unrecognizable. Whoever had done this clearly hadn't made much of an attempt to cover their tracks. But on top of this gruesome discovery, police also uncovered a list of bank statements on the dining room table, with many of the transactions circled and highlighted. Meanwhile, Steven's daughter Courtney was nowhere to be found. And so with this conspicuous fact and their interview with Elaine, who was quite aware of the issues between Steven, his daughter, and her boyfriend, police immediately began to conduct a search for Courtney and Michael. Now, the truth was that neither of them made much of an effort to run and hide. Police found Michael Morin in a restroom located in a mall across the street from the Schulhoff's apartment. And just as Elaine claimed, Michael was wearing one of Steven's t-shirts. But in addition, he also had Steven's wallet, car keys, and his credit cards. And so they took him in for questioning. As for the search for Courtney, well, that was practically unnecessary. After leaving the apartment earlier in the day, Courtney had simply fled to her mother's house. And before long, her mother Tracy forced her to give herself up to the police. Now, during their interviews with police, Courtney and Michael gave the authorities conflicting stories. According to Michael, after he was kicked out of his parents' house, he began living in Courtney's closet. But one day, when her father arrived home early, Courtney woke Michael up and told him that Steven had discovered that he was living in the house. And from that point forward, he had only been to the house once, and it just so happened to be the evening of February 10th, aka the day of Steven's murder. Originally, Michael claimed he had no idea about Steven's murder. He said that the reason why he was in possession of a bunch of Steven's things was because Courtney had given them to him, and when he asked why, she said she would explain later. And then she told him to walk the dog, and he did what she asked. As for why he fled to the mall, well, that's because he was worried about Steven realizing that he was hovering near the apartment and associating with Courtney. However, after police informed Michael that Stephen had been found dead, he suddenly changed his tune. Now he started crying, claiming that much of what happened was a blur. He said he suddenly blacked out, only to wake up and realize that he was holding a bloody baseball bat. He also admitted to the murder, but said that Courtney was essentially the mastermind behind it all, and that after Courtney figured out that her father wanted to confront her about maxing out his credit cards, she asked Michael to murder him, to which Michael agreed. So essentially, he went from saying he knew nothing about the murder to being asked to commit the murder, and yet knowing little about the actual crime itself. All in all, it was just strange and contradictory. And as for Courtney's interview with police, well, hers wasn't exactly much better. And actually, she gave two separate statements. During the first one, Courtney basically just blamed the entire ordeal on Michael. She claimed not to have any knowledge of her father's death until Michael told her about it. However, in a separate confession, she provided the investigators with a significant amount of more detail. Courtney continued saying that yes, the murder was all Michael's idea, but she assisted him in moving Stephen's dog out of the room before it all happened, and that she left the baseball bat right next to the bedroom door for him to use it. Meanwhile, as Michael was killing her father in his sleep, she could hear what was taking place from outside of the room. But then later on, at the end of her criminal trial in September of 2006, Courtney's story changed considerably. When the trial had commenced and she was ultimately found guilty of murder, she was asked if she wanted to make any remarks. And despite claiming to be not guilty throughout the entire trial, her statement went as follows. Your Honor, I would like to openly admit in court that Michael Morin is not the person who killed my father. I was. So I accept full responsibility and I accept the verdict. So needless to say, this was quite a shocking admission to everyone in the courtroom. But after that, she was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. When the verdict was announced, she demonstrated no signs of any emotion. And then, less than a year later, when Michael Morin's trial took place in April of 2007, Courtney repeated her claims that she was the lone culprit and that Michael wasn't aware of any of it. But this contradicted a lot of Michael's own testimony. In fact, he even provided additional details about what happened, claiming that following the murder, he and Courtney drove up to McDonald's 20 minutes away, and even considering throwing Stephen's body off of a bridge. So in the end, Michael Morin too was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison. The most recent update is that in 2017, Courtney Schulhoff's sentence was reduced to about 40 years. But all in all, this case is one of the more unusual ones we've done on this channel. Despite both culprits being sentenced and convicted, to this day, we still don't know exactly what happened. Now obviously, Stephen Schulhoff was murdered, and the murder weapon was a baseball bat. As for which one of the two actually committed the murder, it's still pretty much a question mark. Because while Courtney did admit to killing her father, Michael also admitted to killing him. And investigators found a bloody t-shirt belonging to Stephen in the closet that Michael was living in. And as we know, Michael was frequently wearing Stephen's t-shirts. In addition, Michael was 6'4" and 220 pounds, whereas Courtney was 5'1" and 95 pounds. So the amount of force required to murder someone with a baseball bat would most likely be easier if done by someone a bit larger. However, Stephen Schulhoff was sleeping while it happened, and Courtney's description of the crime was quite detailed. In fact, she was even able to describe to investigators the sounds her father made as he was dying. So, who really knows? Either way, I'd prefer not to speculate. But anyways, thank you for watching this episode of High Time Crime. If true crime is your thing, then please subscribe and hit the like button because that's all we do. I also have a second account with my brother named Horrifying where We tell stories about everything paranormal. This includes true crime, mysteries, and things that are just downright spooky. I'd greatly appreciate if you subscribe to that too. I hope you have a great rest of your day. Take care, friend.